Last week we covered kind of the first part of the medieval church, which the medieval church is really what you could say the church between the fall of Rome and the beginning of the Reformation. That's the medieval church. It's about 1,000 years. We covered the first 200 to 300 years of that last week. And now we're finishing out the first millennium with this final lesson for this module, because next week we don't have Wednesday nights, and then we come back. So the final lesson for this module is called The Rise of Christendom. Okay? So we saw Christianity begin to take root in all these different barbarian tribes last week. We saw kings converting, right? King Clovis, King Ethelred over in England. St. Patrick goes to the Irish. St. Boniface goes to the Franks, right? The gospel's spreading among these people, and they're receiving it, and they're converting. And so as the millennium closes, we begin to see the full effect that the gospel has on these nations. And it gives rise to what we call Christendom. Now, that's a word that you may have heard of before. It's not a word you'll find in the Bible. It's more of I guess you could say sort of a political term or a social term. And there's different ways of defining Christendom. I've chosen to define it as the dominion of Christianity, or you could even say the dominance of Christianity over the culture and politics of nations. And it's nations plural because it's Christendom. Like, it's not just one nation, it's multiple nations. And this is something that can be kind of hard for modern Christians to grasp, because we have grown up believing and being taught that religion and politics should have nothing to do with each other, that they should never even see each other from a mile across the field or what. Like, they should never associate with each other, which is completely false. Religion is always going to influence politics, because religion has to do with what people believe is right and wrong. And what you believe is right and wrong is going to influence what laws you pass. So religion's always going to influence politics. But this idea of like a very harsh separation of church and state is a radically new mindset, right? For all of human history, all of recorded human history, nations had a religious identity, right? You look in the Old Testament, all these nations have a God that they pray to. Right, and they even define that God by being a God of the Canaanites or the Egyptians or the Mesopotamians, or then the God of Israel. Right, so nations had a religious identity, and even nations that allowed a level of religious freedom, like the Roman Empire, they still had a Roman religion. Right, there were still the Roman deities that you prayed to, even though they let the Jews do their things, and at times they let Christians do their things. There was still an identity that nations had, like they were self-aware of their religious identity. And nations that came to embrace Christianity were no exception, right? They went from being pagan kings to being Christian kings, right? Because Christianity, it does teach a separation of church and state, but it doesn't teach that leaders of a country are supposed to pretend like Jesus just isn't Lord, right? The separation of church and state is saying that the king can't decide who gets excommunicated, and the church leaders can't decide who gets executed, right? They're separate in terms of responsibility. The state has its responsibility, the church has its responsibility. But both of them are supposed to honor God. Both of them are supposed to recognize that Jesus is Lord, right? Because it would be blasphemous for a self-professed Christian who then becomes a civil leader in some sense, to get up there and say, well, in my public office, I have to pretend Jesus isn't Lord. That would be blasphemous, right? The Bible teaches that kings and rulers are servants of God. It literally says it in Romans 13:4. It says they are servants of God to execute justice. And servants should be aware of who they're serving. Otherwise, they're not going to be very good at their job, right? If you did not know who your employer was, you'd have a very hard time working for them. It'd be very confusing. And this is the natural result of the gospel truly being accepted by people, right? When people's hearts are changed through the gospel, they act differently. And when this happens to the majority of a nation, or even just to the most influential people in a nation, the nation will act more Christian. Okay? The gospel doesn't just change our heart, but then the rest of us stays the same. No, it works its way out through our fingertips. right? That's why we talk about works following faith. That's what this means. And Christendom is just that being worked out on a national scale. So Christendom is far from a bad thing. Yes, there were problems. You'll also hear people complain about, back in the medieval ages, you had the church just executing people willy-nilly. No, they didn't do that. They had a system of trials. The Pope did not run everything. There was still a somewhat separation of church and state. But it was actually a very good thing. Christendom was overall a good thing. Not just for Europe or America, but for the world as a whole, right? There were problems that came with it, but those problems pale in comparison to the atrocities committed by those who rejected Christianity. So people can complain about, the Crusades and the Spanish Inquisition and all this stuff. It's like the body count from the Spanish Inquisition is Planned Parenthood on a slow Tuesday afternoon, right? That's the comparison here, right? So let's be humble when we try to critique those of the past and be aware of the blood that's on our culture's hands. Okay, we're not doing much better. We just make it look nice and neat. So Christendom, generally good. There were problems, but generally it's good. So that out of the way, let's get into some things that developed around this time. And the first one is the rise of Islam, right? So I'll let you know now, this lesson is going to be a little more it may sound a little more like European history than specifically church history, but the reason I'm doing this is because I want you to see the effect that Christianity's had on the world, and not just stick to the people within the Church Institute. But the rise of Islam. Okay, I'm assuming you all know what Islam is. Islam was started by a guy named Muhammad, who lived in the Arabian Peninsula for the 6th and 7th century. This isn't going to be a detailed apologetic against Islam or anything. I'm not going to go into all the differences, but I'm just going to give you the basics, right? It was started by a guy named Muhammad, who lived in the Arabian Peninsula. And in the year 610, Muhammad claimed he was visited by the angel Gabriel, right? Gabriel from the Bible. And he said that Gabriel told him the words of God, or as the word for God in Arabic is Allah. He told him the words of God and ordered him to write it down. And these words later became the Quran, which is the holy book of Islam, or one of the holy books of Islam, right? Now, many of the teachings of Muhammad do contradict Christian doctrine. That's pretty clear. There's a reason they're different religions. But the two most important ones I put him here. He denied Jesus was God. And he said the Bible had been distorted by Jews and Christians. And this isn't just something that Islam teaches. This is something that Mormonism teaches. This is something that Jehovah's Witnesses teach too, right? The only difference is that Mormons and Jehovah's Witnesses will still try to use the Bible, whereas Muslims are more comfortable kind of putting that to the side and sticking to the Quran. But it's worth noting that Muhammad, when he was a teenager, was actually discipled by an Arian monk. And what did the Arians believe? Jesus wasn't God, right? So he's discipled by this Arian monk before this whole visiting by an angel thing happens. So it's pretty clear to see the influence that had on his view of Jesus, right? If he already believes Jesus isn't God, like one with the Father, then it's not a stretch for him to be convinced by a demon or by some figment of his imagination that, Jesus was actually just a prophet, right? That he wasn't even a divine being at all. So just wanted to point that out, that Arianism is still kind of working its way. It still poses a threat to the church even after the councils. So Muhammad began preaching this new faith in the city of Mecca, which today is in modern-day Saudi Arabia. It's on the western coast of the Arabian Peninsula. So he's preaching in the city of Mecca, but he fails to gather any substantial following. And eventually he's exiled from the city. They kick him out. They're like, we don't want you here. So he went to another city called Medina, where he managed to get a larger following. And the reason he likely managed to get a larger following is because he adjusted the message of Islam to say, hey, do you want to wage holy war on these people? Do you want to get away with murder and rape and adultery and theft and say you're good with God, great, I have a new religion to sell you. Because that's a lot of what Islam teaches, right? Now, not every single Muslim, especially today, takes those passages as seriously, but they are there, yes?
So, funny thing about Islam is Allah is all just, but there's no way for him to get rid of sin. And so, Muslims just live their entire life trying to be good enough in hopes that God will literally just sweep their sins under the rug.
Right. And Allah is also called the Great Deceiver. So Muslims will admit, like, yeah, Allah could just be lying to all of us. He could just be a giant troll. I'm like, oh, geez. Very, very anxious lifestyle. But anyway, so he preaches in this crowd to Medina. He manages to gain a big following, shocker, because he's saying, hey, those sinful urges you have, they're actually good. Now let's go retake a city. So he gets this large following. He goes back, he takes Mecca by force. And that's why Mecca is kind of seen as the holy city for Islam. He takes the city in 630. And 2 years later, he dies. And by Muhammad's death, Islam had kind of spread throughout the Arabian Peninsula. And on his deathbed, I believe it's on his deathbed, he commands his followers to wage holy war, or jihad, on Christians and Jews. Right? So that's where Islam starts with Muhammad, who's seen as the final great prophet. And then here's the spread of Islam. So over here is Mecca, and then there's Medina. And you see it spreads throughout Arabia. And after Islam dies, it goes through Central Asia up here, goes through Middle East, North Africa, even into Spain. And the thing is, this area and Egypt and North Africa, those were all formerly Christian lands. I mean, we talked about Augustine last week. He was from North Africa, right? Alexandria was a Christian city. Antioch up here was a Christian city. Jerusalem still had a lot of churches in it, right? Yes?
Another funny thing about Islam is I'd like if somebody could find me a list of countries that peacefully converted to Islam.
Right. Maybe Indonesia. That might be the one. Because I think they're the biggest Islamic nation. And obviously this caliphate didn't reach them. So that might be the one. But yeah, you see, Islam spreads very rapidly. And it does so because it's doing it at the point of a sword. Right? Christianity spread rapidly too. But it was through conversion. Right? It was through preaching. It was through talking to people. And it did spread all over Europe. But Islam spreads way faster in a much shorter amount of time. And the treatment to Christians in these lands varied. Some places they would just kill you. Just come in, kill you, kill your family, maybe take your children as slaves, that's it. Other places they would allow Christians and Jews to live there, but they were essentially like second-class citizens. That's even maybe like a third-class citizen. You had to pay extra taxes to live there. You weren't allowed to basically participate in any political way. You may be denied access to the markets. I think one person even made Christians wear an 8-pound cross around their necks to kind of identify them as Christians. So it varied. But even the places where there was toleration, and I use that term very loosely, it was still bad to live as a Christian. And as you can see here, so Christendom is Europe, and we see the Muslims kind of pose two threats. You see here in Spain, they could attack the Franks. And then over here in the east, they're attacking the Byzantine Empire, which is the Eastern Roman Empire. And all this land right here was formerly Byzantine. So the Byzantines have lost like half their empire to the Muslims. But we'll talk more about the Muslims when we get to the Crusades. I just wanted to give you a taste of it now. And maybe not get you excited, because this is pretty horrific stuff we're talking about, but get you interested at least. All right, moving on from that. We're going back to the Frankish Empire, right? We talked about the Franks last week. We talked about King Clovis and his wife Clotilde, who continually ministered the gospel to him, even though he rejected it, and then he finally came to faith, sort of out of desperation, because he was in battle, and he said, well, I'm losing, might as well give it a shot, and God actually answered his prayer. So Clovis spread the empire pretty wide, all these darker green areas or areas he conquered. But his descendants grew less and less capable or interested in leading the empire, right? They kind of got lazy, as most descendants of great kings do. They get lazy. They kind of rest on their laurels. And so the governing of the empire fell to an officer known as the mayor of the palace. So we're going to look at a couple of those guys because they're important. So the first mayor of the palace was a guy named Charles Martel. Does anyone know what the name Martel means? It's actually a nickname. I just want to see if any of you do. Okay, it means Charles the Hammer. That's what Martel means, is Charles the Hammer. And he's called that primarily because he has a very famous battle called the Battle of Tours in 732, which is kind of in northern France, where he stops the Muslims from getting further into Western Europe. Right? The Muslims took Spain. Most of Spain is under their control. They try to go up and take France, or what's now known as France. And Charles Martel stops them dead cold, and they never advance past beyond the Spanish borders. So that's in 732. So he's the most important one, or one of the most important ones. His son is a guy called Pepin the Short. Now, that may have been an ironic name, kind of like Little John from Robin Hood, where he's actually the biggest guy there. So that's probably an ironic nickname. So Pepin was probably actually a pretty big guy. And Pepin the Short is notable because he rescued the Pope from a group called the Lombards. Now, the Lombards were, let me go back a slide. Oh, wrong way. The Lombards, you see them down here. They kind of occupied northern Italy. And they had been kind of bothering the Franks for a while, but they've also been bothering the Pope because the Lombards were all Arians, and so they didn't like the Pope very much. And so the Pope sends a message to Pepin, says, hey, can you come save me? Yes?
Can you go to the next slide?
Oh, right. Thank you. Pope sends a message to Pepin saying, hey, I need some help. These Lombards pose a threat to me. So Pepin marches his army through the Alps, down into Rome, kicks the Lombards out, kind of makes them stay in their place. And in order to avoid this from happening, he actually gave the Pope a kingdom, and that kingdom is called the Papal States. So you see that little green area right there on Italy, that was the Papal States. And the Papal States, as the name implies, was a country that was run by the Pope. So this is where we see a transition from the Pope being a purely religious figure to now being also a political figure. We're going to see a lot of that in this lesson, right? And this is one of the problems that the Reformation later tried to deal with. And even today, there is still a country that's run by the Pope. Does anyone know what it is? Vatican City. It is the smallest country in the world. It is so small, it not only fits inside another country, it fits inside the capital city of another country. Does anyone know what country that is? Rome, yeah, Rome, Italy. Yeah, my brother actually, him and his wife went there this past summer, and he said it was very warm there, and they have no air conditioning in all the buildings there. So not a fun place to live, I guess. It's 100% Catholic population, though, shocker. So yeah, he gives them the Papal States, and as a thank you to Pepin for rescuing him and giving him a country, the Pope crowns Pepin King of the French, or King of the Franks. Not the French yet, thankfully. He crowns him King of the Franks. And so Pepin essentially displaces the line of descendants from Clovis, and he sets up what's called the Carolingian dynasty, which is named after Charles, his father, Charles Martel. And Pepin had two sons to whom he each gave half the empire, but one of the sons died young because he was very sick. And so the empire passed on to his only living son, and this is the first of two great kings we're going to talk about tonight. His son's name was Charlemagne. Charlemagne is French for Charles the Great.
Oh, looks so pretty. It's a setup.
Yes, that's a real life photo. Yeah, so Charlemagne was one of the greatest Christian kings to ever rule. There's very little competition. There's one other guy, which we'll talk about later, but Charlemagne is up there. And he's also known as I didn't put this on there, he's also known as the father of modern Europe. And that's because of what he does in terms of his policies with the Frankish Empire, which we'll get into. But he truly sought to embody Christ in his role as king to the best of his abilities. Right? So he had we'll talk about some of the things he did. He had a couple of military ventures in his career. So he kept the Saxons, or he conquered the Saxons in the north part of Germany, the area where Boniface ministered. The Saxons were always kind of a problem for him, but he managed to conquer them. So he brought them under his domain. And then he also continued to keep the Muslims at bay in Spain, right? So the Muslims are still there in Spain. They're still trying to get into Europe. Charlemagne continues to keep them in Spain. Says, no, you're not going to come in here. And then also the Lombards, he finally brought them under his control completely by the end of his reign. Now, the thing Charlemagne is known for, or one of the things that happens to him, was that in 799, Charlemagne was on a pilgrimage to Rome on Christmas Day, and Pope Leo III surprises him. We have suspicion that Charlemagne kind of set this up, but Pope Leo surprises him with a Christmas gift. And that Christmas gift is, you get to be the new Roman emperor, which is kind of funny because his empire doesn't even have Rome in it. But the Pope crowns him the new Roman emperor. Now, this is 800, basically the year 800. Rome had not been around for almost 300 years at this point, right? So there had been no Roman emperor for 300 years. But this essentially made the Frankish Empire kind of the successor to the Roman Empire, right? So the Roman Empire is this big power. It goes away. The Franks kind of take that mantle. They're not as great as the Roman Empire, but they are sort of a spiritual successor to it in a sense. And so Charlemagne took this role seriously, right? He didn't try to shrug it off, but he also didn't try to use it as a source of pride, right? In fact, the Eastern Roman Empire, which we talked about, that's still in power, and the emperor there kind of got worried when he heard about Charlemagne being crowned Roman emperor, because he's like, is this guy going to try to take me over and reunite the Roman Empire? Charlemagne sent him a letter saying, nope, that's not happening. Don't worry about it. You're my brother king, right? We're going to defend Christendom together. So that was the kind of guy Charlemagne was. He was not power hungry, but he was not afraid to use power either. That's important. One of his greatest contributions was he established schools for gifted children, whether rich or poor. By gifted, I mean kids that actually wanted to learn, that had an interest in learning. And these were not just for wealthy students or wealthy children or noble children. These were for children of any class, right? They would be handpicked, whether they're peasants or whether they're nobles. They would come to the school. Charlemagne paid for everything, right? Paid for their room, their board, their food, their education. He paid for all of it because he believed that an educated society was more likely to be a holier society, right? Now, obviously, education on its own doesn't do that, but it helps, right? He even promoted the education of women. He had 3 daughters, I believe, and he had all of them educated, right? Which is something you didn't really see a lot in the Middle Ages, but it happens, and it happens because of Christendom, right? It's Christianity that's bringing a lot of these positive social changes that everyone wants to credit secular humanism for, but it was happening a lot earlier. And because of this, Charlemagne is known as the father of modern Europe, because he gives it education, he sort of defines its boundaries, and I believe even from the amount of children that he had, that it's something like 20% of all European males are descendant from Charlemagne in some way. It's very interesting, but well, he had multiple, but they weren't all at the same time, I don't think. Two of them died. I think he had 3. I think 2 of them died. This is the Middle Ages. I mean, people can die all the time, right? Yeah. Although I don't believe he allowed his daughters to get married, not because he was being a jealous father, because he didn't want a rival line of descendants to rival his son's succession. So, yeah. But again, Charlemagne, not a perfect guy. He also did, whenever he would capture people, he would sometimes force them to get baptized or die. So again, not perfect. But again, that's how warfare was done back then. If you surrendered, you pledged allegiance to your victor's god. That's how it worked. Or you died. But Charlemagne did everything knowing he would have to give an account before Jesus, right? There's records of him saying to his nobles, one day we will all stand before Christ, right? Could you imagine like the president saying that to his cabinet? Never imagine. It would never work, right? But Charlemagne did it because he truly believed what the Bible says. He believed, yeah, I as a king am a servant of God, and I am responsible for the defense and the nurturing of my people. He took that role seriously. And his final words, according to what we have, were, "Into your hands, Lord, I commit my spirit." So quoting Jesus there on his deathbed. So that's Charlemagne. This is just touching the tip of the iceberg with this guy. There's so much that he's contributed, not even just to church history, but also Western European history. So he's a guy worth looking more into. I'm giving you just the bare minimum here. Let's look at some of his descendants, because this is important. So, like I said, yes?
What were his last words?
"Into your hands, Lord, I commit my spirit." So the same thing Jesus said on the cross. So like I said earlier, great kings usually have descendants that disappoint them because, it's hard to live up to that level of greatness. So Charlemagne's descendants, we'll look at a couple of them. These aren't all of them. Like I said, he had a lot of kids, which is why so many people are descended from him. So his son was called Louis the Pious. That name alone should kind of give you an idea for how he compares to his dad. Would you rather be called the Pious or be called the Great?
What does pious mean?
Pious means like virtuous. It's not you should all want to be pious.
It sounds weird.
But between the two, I'd rather be called the Great. So Charlemagne's son, Louis the Pious, he succeeded his father upon his death, and he tried to live up to his father's legacy, as you would, but he lacked the political skill of Charlemagne. And so Louis ended up dividing the Frankish Empire into 3 kingdoms for each of his sons after he died. It's usually not a good idea to do that. That usually is just a recipe for a civil war to happen. A civil war actually didn't happen, but you're splitting up the empire that weakens it. Generally, it usually weakens it. So he splits it up into these 3 kingdoms here. So you kind of already start to see the modern borders forming, right? You see a little bit of France right there, and then Germany, Italy's down here. It's just this middle part right here. And then a couple generations later, you have a guy named Henry the Fowler, presumably ancestor of Wade Fowler.
Ancestor.
Yeah, not descendant, it'd be ancestor.
It's a reverse history.
Maybe he traveled back in time. Anyway, so he comes along, he kind of eliminates this 3rd kingdom here, and so he creates the French-German border that we kind of have today, except they're not called France and Germany yet, they're called the Western Frankish Empire and the Eastern Frankish Empire. And then he also creates Poland, which is nice for all the Poles. And then he has a son named Otto the Great. And Otto the Great creates a union of all these separate kingdoms in the German-Italian area, and he unites them into this big yellow country here called the Holy Roman Empire. Right? So he's really leaning into this Roman emperor thing. Charlemagne was called the Roman emperor, but he never renamed the empire the Roman Empire. Otto the Great does. Right? Otto the Great claimed to be the successor to Augustus, Constantine, and Charlemagne. And so he's like, I'm the Roman emperor, I'm going to remake the Roman Empire. Unlike Charlemagne, who was a good man, who was a good Christian, who cared deeply about the things of God, Otto is more of a politician. He sees the church as less of the bride of Christ and more as a pawn that he can kind of use to get political favors, right? And so at this point, the Vikings, who we're going to get to in a second, the Vikings are starting to raid Northern Europe. In fact, they're actually raiding the entire European coast. And so this poses a threat to Rome. It poses a threat to the Pope, right? The Pope does not really have armies at his disposal. He's maybe got some security, but that's about it. And so churches are really dependent upon these nations to defend them. And the biggest nation is the Holy Roman Empire. And so the Pope has to kind of look to Otto to defend him. And so Otto provides that protection, but he continually kind of looks for ways to hold that over the Pope. Say like, hey, you should grant me this kind of power, or maybe I'll not send my troops to defend you from the Vikings. Oh no, right? And so this is where we kind of see this tension between church and state. And there's kind of a bit of a back and forth as to who has authority over who. Later on, I think it's in the 1100s, the Pope actually excommunicates like an entire kingdom, I think. And it's a challenge. And eventually the king of that nation, he breaks and goes to the Pope and begs for forgiveness for 3 days, barefoot in the snow. And that kind of showed Europe, okay, the popes sort of got the reins over kings, right? Because if the people in your country think you got them excommunicated, they're going to be really mad at you. So this is where we see that tension, that political tension that really becomes a problem later on and is addressed ultimately by the Reformation. But that's where we'll leave the Franks. The Holy Roman Empire is important, but we're not going to talk much more about it. It actually stays around until the 1800s, and then Napoleon gets rid of it. So it sticks around for a while. All right, next, Vikings. We'll talk about Vikings. Now notice what popular Viking attire is not shown here.
The tie, the skirts, the horn.
The horns.
Oh.
Because no one wore those helmets.
But they're cool.
No, they're not. Because if you're in battle and you can what tactical advantage? You could grab the horn and then cut your head off.
Or just like
No.
form a whole line and then they just ram the opposing.
Yes, and then break all of your necks. No, so the Vikings. So they're here around this time. And Vikings is a broad term. There's no one country or one group of people that we say, oh, there's the Vikings. They're from different Scandinavian tribes. And so at this point, Scandinavia, it's up there. It has yet to be Christianized, right? Most of the continent and England and Ireland, they're Christianized, right? The gospel is there and it's being taught. Very little of the gospel has gone into Scandinavia because there's scary Vikings there. And so these are pagan people, pagan worshipers, and they are raiding the European coast, right? They even get down into Italy, which is why the Pope gets scared of them. And so, as you can tell, they especially liked raiding Britain and Ireland too, but especially Britain. And last week, we talked a little bit about Britain. We talked about how they went from Christian under the Roman Empire, back to pagan, because the Anglo-Saxons invaded, and then back to Christian, because Augustine of Canterbury went there and ministered to them. But now England faces a Viking invasion. And that's not just raiding, this is conquest. Right? They're actually looking to take over England. And so this is where we see the reign of probably my favorite of the two kings. Because Charlemagne's fine, but he is still French. And so I can't like him that much. Alfred the Great. This dude's amazing. Okay. So as you can tell, Christians are not very creative with the titles they give their kings. So far we've had Constantine the Great, Charlemagne, which is Charles the Great, Otto the Great, Alfred the Great. So we're really not that creative, but...
Okay, but you just said that being called pious was weird.
Okay, but come on, you couldn't be called like the Magnificent or the Extraordinary.
The better. That's still the great, though.
But it's different words.
Like great is like 5.
Come on, open up a thesaurus or something. Anyway,
I
so
think they have those.
they did. It's just not many people could read back then.
Volume 2.
Yeah. Anyway, so the king who answered the challenge of the Vikings was Alfred the Great. And he's the only English ruler to ever bear the title of the Great. Right? So at least among England, he's the only one that's got the title of the Great. He was king of Wessex, because at this time there is no England as a country. There's different Anglo-Saxon nations on the island of Britain, and Wessex is one of them. It's kind of down near towards the southwest. So he's king of Wessex, and he is most famous for fighting off the Vikings. Now we're going to talk more about him fighting the Vikings. This is just some facts about Alfred himself. So other than fighting off the Vikings, he made several other contributions to English culture, which of course flows down and affects American culture because we are descended from England. We're better than them though. And so he set up the Witan, which was a precursor to Parliament. Witan was an early form of representative government where leaders from the tribes would gather and pass laws for the country as a whole, right? So he's setting that up. He also established schools because he was a big fan of Charlemagne, and he liked that he established schools, and so he did the same thing. Probably the most influential contribution he had was Alfred's Code. And this code informed how rulers and judges were to judge cases and trials, right? And this became the basis for what's called English common law. If you ever take any kind of law classes in college, you'll learn about common law. Common law is essentially law that develops out of court cases, right? So if there's like some kind of unique situation that no on-the-books law deals with, and a judge passes a certain ruling on it, and everyone kind of approves of it, that will become common law. And people will kind of appeal to that. They'll say, the legal term is precedence, right? It's like, oh, there's precedence for, ruling in favor of this. So that's common law. And that influenced the founding laws of America. But Alfred didn't just come up with this system on his own. He drew a lot of it from the book of Deuteronomy, right? Especially you read parts of Deuteronomy that talk about only on two or three witnesses will a person be tried. Okay, that's from Deuteronomy, and Alfred's applying it, and that's where we get ideas of fair trial, which is included in our Constitution, right? So a lot of the stuff that we are familiar with as Americans comes from England, and then especially from Alfred. So that's the facts part. Now let's get to the Viking part. So the Viking Wars. The specific Vikings that raided England in this time were called the Danes. Where are the Danes from?
Danish.
They're from Danish. Yes, they're from the pastry. No, where are they from? From Denmark. Yes. No, they're from Denmark. By the way, the side note, the Danish flag, apparently, according to legend, fell out of the sky as a gift from God because they needed a flag. And it's basically if you ever see, I think it's the white cross and then the red background. And that's what all the other Scandinavian countries use as their flag. So it's pretty funny. But they began raiding Britain around the 800s. And for most of this time, the Anglo-Saxons just paid the Danes off, right? They paid them off to stop them from raiding, right? The Danes would come in and raid. They say, hey, you want us to stop? Pay us the Dane Guild, which was essentially their extortion price. And the Anglo-Saxons would say, well, all right, fine, I'll get you to stop. But what happens when you do that?
They want more.
They want more, right? They come back and they raid. They ask for more money. So eventually you either run out of money or you run out of bodies or you run out of land. And in the 860s, the what's the term I'm looking for? The dam broke, right? And war broke out because the Danes massacred a bunch of monks at Crowland Abbey. Now, this was a big deal because in Abbey, which is where monks stayed, they were seen as off limits in warfare. And the reason is because an abbey was basically like a hospital and a school and charity all rolled into one, right? There was no military advantage to taking an abbey or let alone killing people there, right? They pose no threat to you. These are monks. They're not trained in combat in any way. The only reason you would kill them is if you're a murderous, like, psychopath, which is what the Danes were. And so they kill all these monks. And the Saxons are shocked. And so they start to fight the Danes. They have a military response. And so one of the leaders of the Saxons was Alfred, who at this time was a 22-year-old prince with no combat experience. So this would essentially be like me going and leading an army, right? Not a good idea, right? Not a good idea. I mean, so Alfred is 22 years old. He has no combat experience. He's a prince at this time. He's not king yet. And he has part of his army at a place called Ashdown. And he's meeting all these Danish forces. His brother has the other half of the army. But his brother is taking too long praying in the cathedral. And he doesn't show up in time. So Alfred's there with half an army of, kind of a ragtag group of soldiers against all the Danish forces. So what does Alfred do? He says, form a shield wall. Okay, you're familiar with what a shield wall is? Where basically you all get to put your shields together and just withstand the storm. He says, put a shield wall together. And it works. The Vikings keep smashing into the shield wall, and it doesn't break. And eventually, the Vikings are weakened to the point where Alfred can send his men out, and then his brother shows up, and they take Ashdown. So this is a good initial victory. This gives them confidence. But then that's followed up with a bunch of defeats. So he had a good start, and then he got beaten down. Beginner's luck, absolutely. So Alfred's army dwindled because most of them are not professional soldiers. Most of them are just men of the land. They're farmers, right? And at this time, there was no constant supply of food coming in. You had to go home and farm your food if you wanted you and your family to survive during the winter. So these soldiers can't just stay there, or most of them can't. They have to go home and farm, especially because the Vikings are raiding and taking everything they grow. So his army begins to dwindle. And so Alfred adapts. He takes this little force and starts launching guerrilla warfare tactics against the Danes, right? Hit and run tactics, things like that. It's kind of similar to King David when Absalom, or I guess when Saul too, but Saul or Absalom, when they take the throne and David's kind of forced to have his group of mighty men that kind of run around Israel and try to defeat him. That's what Alfred's doing here. But the Danes keep beating him because they have more forces. They have stronger tactics, things like that. And eventually he's pushed back to Wessex, so back to the southwestern corner of England. And while he's at Wessex, okay, yeah, I did put that. While he's at Wessex, Alfred prays and fasts basically every day. He's in constant prayer. He's praying psalms to God. He's fasting. And he's asking God for victory. But he's also asking God if there is a way that the Danes can be saved. Is there a way that they could come to faith in Christ? Because he recognizes, he's like, I don't deserve to know you, Lord. I don't deserve it any more than they do. So let them come to Christ as well. So he's in a pretty bad position here. But that eventually turns around. So Alfred's prayer was answered in 878. There was a minor victory. So a Saxon prince managed to escape a siege by all these Danes. And in doing that, he weakened the Danish forces. And so he gets out, he sends word to Alfred, says, hey, they're weakened. Now's our time. Get as many men together as you can, and let's go fight them. So he does. Alfred gathers all these Saxon armies, gets as many men as any man that can hold a sword. They're coming and they're going to fight. And he meets them at Eddington, which is a town just north of Wessex. And Alfred essentially tries the same strategy again. He says, form a shield wall. Okay? And he says, all right, form a shield wall, and we're just going to push against the Danish force and not break. The Danes do the same thing. So you got two shield walls smashing into each other. And eventually the Danish lines broke because they were weakened. And so the Danes are forced to flee to a castle. They flee to a castle. Alfred and his men are killing everyone who's not making it into the castle. And they surround them. They lay siege to the castle. And they cut off all his supplies. All right, so they're going to starve to death or they're going to surrender. Those are the two options. Oh yeah, there you go. Forced to retreat to a castle, Alfred besieged them. And then Guthrum, who was the Danish king, his name was Guthrum, he is worried about surrendering because he thinks he's going to get tortured to death. Because that's what he did to all the kings he captured, many of whom were relatives of Alfred. And when I say torture them, he would, I forget what it was called, but it was essentially like they would fillet the back and then pull the skin off and then sacrifice that to Odin, right? So you wouldn't just be killed. You wouldn't just be tortured. You would also be made into a pagan sacrifice and probably eaten. Not a good way to go. And Guthrum thinks, oh, this is going to happen to me, right? After all the people I've killed, after all the things I've done, they are going to do this to me. But it's either that or starve to death. And he's like, hey, maybe they'll be merciful and just cut my head off. So he surrenders to Alfred after 2 weeks. And he goes and meets Alfred, expecting that, it's going to be over soon. And much to his shock, Alfred offers very generous terms of peace to Guthrum, including like a sub-rulership of a part of England. So he doesn't even kick him out of England. He says, hey, you can have this part over here and you'll be under my authority. What do you say? And Guthrum is shocked. He's like, I thought I was going to at least be killed, and you're offering me peace. Why are you offering me peace? And Alfred says, because I serve the Prince of Peace. And Guthrum asks, how can I know this Prince of Peace? And then a month later, Guthrum's baptized. Right? This is what I mean when I say, like, Christendom was a good thing. This would have never happened had it not been for the gospel going out. Had it not been for the gospel changing England, changing France, changing these groups of people, right? By the way, Guthrum remained a Christian until his death, so it's not like he just got baptized to get out of it, right? Like, he remained a Christian until he died. But this is something that can only happen when the gospel comes in and changes someone, right? The gospel changed Alfred, and Alfred, even though he's a king, even though he is doing acts of violence, justifiably so, but still, even though he's killing all these people, he's still willing to show mercy. He's still able to show mercy because he understands I am still a servant of Christ, and Christ has shown me mercy. And this is where I want to leave you, is that the gospel can reach the hearts of kings. Turn to Isaiah chapter 49, and you'll see where I'm getting this from. Would anyone like to read these two verses? All right, Ben.
Thus says the Lord God, behold, I will lift up my hands to the nations, and raise my signal to the peoples. And they shall bring your sons in their arms, and your daughters shall be carried on their shoulders. Kings shall be your foster fathers, and their queens your nursing mothers. With their faces to the ground, they shall bow to you, and lift the dust of your feet. Then you will know that I am the Lord. Those who wait for me shall not be put to shame.
Okay. So this is God's promise to his people, especially since they're going through exile at the time that he's writing this to them. He's saying, look, you're downtrodden now, but one day kings will be your foster fathers and queens will be your nursing mothers, right? The most powerful people in this world will serve you, will bow to you. In modern Christianity, especially Western Christianity, we have the mindset that the gospel is solely about the life to come, that it's just about heaven, it's just about spiritual stuff, and that it says nothing about the world here and now. Yes, the gospel is about our ultimate and final salvation and eternal life, and that's amazing, and that's the most important thing. But Scripture is clear that the spread of the gospel will bring the conversion of nations, right? Not just a couple people from each tribe, but nations, which means kings and queens and presidents and prime ministers will also come to faith in Christ. And when that happens, they will rule according to Christian principles. And this is not just a hopeful fantasy because we just saw it play out in history, right? Now, where we live right now, it's very easy to think, yeah, that's kind of a hopeful ideal, but it doesn't actually happen. No, it does. It happened to Charlemagne. It happened to Alfred the Great. It happened to Constantine. I would argue it happened to George Washington, right? There were men throughout history that ruled righteously in the name of Christ, not thinking that they were Christ, but recognizing I've been given this role. I need to do it well. And when you study these Christian kings, it broadens your view as to how Christians can act. Because so often, it can feel like a lot of modern pastors and teachers today make it seem like good Christian behavior is to be like a non-offensive, passive, effeminate, nice guy. And I'm talking even from pastors who are generally good on doctrine. I'm not talking about like radical liberals or anything. I'm talking guys who will affirm, the infallibility of Scripture and the resurrection and all that. When they talk about how Christians should act, it just sounds just very effeminate, right? And especially for young men, that's something that's just like, okay, like, I love Jesus, I want to serve him, but you make it sound so like wimpy to be a Christian. But these men the men we study today were honest and heartfelt Christians who desired to love their enemies and show mercy, yet they had no problem taking up a sword and killing people in battle. Not because they enjoyed killing people, because they did it in the name of Christ, because they recognized that he put them in that position to protect his church and to execute justice. And here's the thing, they did not expect to be remembered, right? Alfred did not expect he was going to be king. He was essentially king because his dad died and then his brother was killed. His brother died of sickness. He became king by accident. He thought he was going to die a nobody. But when the responsibility fell in his lap, he said, I'm going to take it because I have to, because God's put me here, right? They simply sought to do their job. They didn't go out there saying, I'm going to be remembered as the great. No. They said, I'm going to do my job. I'm going to do it well. And that's what each of us should be concerned with doing, right? We should not be concerned about whether history will remember us. It likely will not. Even if you're a king, history is probably not going to remember you. How many kings can you guys name? And think about how many kings there have been throughout history, right? Most of them you don't know. Most of them, most people don't know, right? Don't be concerned with that. Be concerned with what has God given me now to do and how can I do it to the best of my abilities? And that will include doing things that may scare you, that may frighten you, that may call you out of your comfort zone. But it's through that God's glory is shown. And God's glory is shown through the people we've covered tonight. So that's where we'll leave you for now.